Hello, my name is Gail Whiffen-Coyle, and I'm the Associate Editor here at Friends Journal. Today, I'm speaking with three authors from our October issue on faithful living. And these three authors come to us from Friends Meeting of San Antonio in Texas. And this is actually a story of an entire meeting living faithfully into a very specific ministry tied to where they are geographically located. The three authors here with me today, starting from the left, is Lee Teran, who is the director of the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic at St. Mary's Law School in San Antonio. And in the middle there is David Bristol. Hi, David. Give a little wave. And then on the right, we have Gretchen Haynes. All three of these friends are involved in Friends Meeting of San Antonio and its ministry to help immigrant families fleeing violence from Central America. So thank you for joining with me today, all three of you.
Thank you.
So why don't we get started with your article. It's called Convergence, a meeting responds to cries of desperation. You've been working on this article for a while now, and we were very excited to publish it in the October issue. Why don't you just give me a little bit of background about how the ministry began? I remember from the article that one of your meeting members attended a workshop at Friends General Conference's 2014 conference gathering. So you've been working on stuff that she's learned there ever since then.
That's right. I'll speak to that.
Yes, our clerk was at the gathering, and at the time that she came back, she gave a couple of workshops. She had taken George Lakey's activism, and at the same time, we became aware of the problem with immigrant families coming across the Texas border and being incarcerated in detention centers about an hour and a half away from us. We heard their stories. It was very compelling. And as a meeting, we decided we needed to know more about what was happening. And we found that there were other people in San Antonio who were also concerned. And so we linked up with what became the Interfaith Welcome Coalition. And so the meeting, we can go into more details about what we did, but that was how we all got involved initially.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Interfaith Coalition. Actually, it is indeed Interfaith Coalition. It involves Mennonites, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Methodists, and Catholics. So this is really a group effort in San Antonio, rallying around what is connected to where you are physically. So I love this story from your meeting because so oftentimes we hear of meetings not really sure where to focus their energy. There's so many problems and issues in the world, and oftentimes it just takes looking in your backyard to see where the need is there in your own community. So David, could you tell us a little bit about the other organization that you guys worked with, Raíces?
Oh, yeah. Raíces is a legal, nonprofit legal group that offer their legal services to immigrants. They've been doing this for a while, but they certainly became focused on this issue because there's so many, mainly mothers and children fleeing Central America and crossing our borders, and immediately ran into problems along the borders, which Raíces has legally fought against, and gathered a group of pro bono attorneys who have represented these women and children. And at this point, I think Dilley still has over 1,000 women and children. But every mother at this point has legal representation from pro bono lawyers all over the United States. And that's been Raíz's real effort to bring a focus to the attorneys. And as they've gotten involved, they've gotten more attorneys involved, and they've been a very dedicated resource for the effort by IWC.
Yeah, and you mentioned Dilley, and that's in reference to Dilley, Texas, where one of the detention centers are, and they go by many names. I know that the government sometimes calls them family residential centers, which is really, misleading. It sounds like they're trying to make it seem like, they're not detaining them. But there's the center in Dilley, and then where's the other center located?
The other center is in Carnes.
Carnes.
The other center is southeast of San Antonio. Dilley is almost like due south.
Okay.
San Antonio.
Right.
And they put centers in areas where there aren't lawyers, and there's not people, there's no support groups, and so people have been willing to travel and set up in these isolated areas, and I think that's made a real difference. The turnout, by people in all these faith groups.
Yeah, totally. And Lee, could you explain a little bit about the detention bond fund that Raíz has, and the meeting's involvement with that?
Yes, the initial response by the government, besides setting up these detention centers, was to refuse to release the women on bond. So the first task that the lawyers had to do was to force the government to allow bonds so that the women could get out. But the bonds were set very high. So one of the responses that IWC and the Friends meeting and Raíces did was to try to raise money so that we could post bonds and get these women out of detention, get the women and children out as quickly as possible, to relieve the tension on the children and to relieve or to help the women prepare for their asylum applications outside of detention.
Okay.
They're very difficult cases to do, and doing them in detention is very hard. Asking lawyers to travel an hour to 2 hours from San Antonio, or many days from other cities if they come here to try to prepare these cases, was very difficult. So trying to get the women out of detention as quickly as possible, get them to travel to places where they could reunite with family members, and then to find other lawyers outside San Antonio that would be able to help them prepare their cases. Gives them a better chance of winning, ultimately winning their asylum claims.
Okay. And what are some examples of what your legal aid clinics have been doing with this issue?
Well, our clinic's one of several law schools from around the country. There's St. Mary's is the clinic that is closest to where the detention centers are, but the University of Texas Immigration Clinic, the University of Houston Immigration Clinic began working with these detainees beginning last year. Since then, the American Immigration Lawyers Association has put together a group of volunteer lawyers and law school clinics from around the country. And they fly into San Antonio. Many of the Friends group, as well as the IWC group, put them up in their homes. And then these lawyers and law students go down to Dilley and to Carnes to provide direct services. So it's now become a national effort. But the law school clinics continue to work. I send students to Dilley. University of Houston, University of Texas also continue to send their students down from time to time to work directly with the detainees and their children.
Wow, that's really, really wonderful. So this, as you said, is a national issue, and one we really can't look away from at this time. Other examples from the article of the meeting and actions that San Antonio Friends Meeting have done, you guys put on a public theater performance to raise money. You've also set aside money from your own budget to contribute to the bond fund that Raíces has. So now I'm wondering, it's been a while since you've submitted this article. What is going on now? What are the updates? What is the meeting focused on now? And then how can friends help that are in other parts of the country?
Well, because of litigation that has been brought over the last year and a half, the government has backed down. They are now releasing far more women than they did before, and they're releasing them much quicker. A federal judge in California has ordered them to release children as quickly as possible, based on a prior lawsuit from several years ago. So more and more the women and children are getting out faster and getting out with lower bonds and some without any bond. Although many of the women are now being released with ankle bracelets that aren't bracelets, they're shackles. So that's another area of work that we're trying to do. So getting attorneys for the women, getting help for them in the communities where they're going to, and it could be help in trying to find a social worker or get their children into school or get the money that's needed just to travel from here to where their families are has become a real task for everybody here. And I know the IWC and the Quaker meeting continues to support those efforts. You can talk about the
Well, I think
giving
one of the
rise.
interesting things that the article was published as these things were developing, the publicity that we generated through vigils and letter writing. We had a congressional delegation of 7 Congress people here in June, and that put pressure that we were able to affect a much broader. We started out concerned about the individual women and children, and we're now much broader in our concern, which is the when we had the march on Dilley, the slogan was "Shut it down." Now that's very different. That's taking on a national policy of dealing with immigrants, making them criminals, criminalizing them. And I think that that's part of what the meeting has been very involved with, in letter writing in particular, and raising awareness as far as possible, and politically, because it's a very political situation. And I think we've been successful in broadening our scope.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you. David, did you want to add something there?
Well, it is political. It's also a humanitarian situation.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the human rights group that came here?
The National Commission of Civil Rights.
National Commission for Civil Rights.
Yeah, and they found Dilley, the detention center in both Dilley and Carnes, horrible. I mean, these children, there is no family residential center. They're behind locked doors. They are tied to their mothers. These children have to stay with their mothers at all times. It's tremendous pressure on the mother and the children. And through visitation, you can see how muted and damaged these children what's happening to them by being in prison. Mm-hmm. And because I think they sense the anxiety of their mothers, and I've been able to see through, because taking kids now to the bus station that now are only there 20 to 30 days, they're a totally different child. I mean, they don't have these blank faces, or they don't just stare at you when you visit with their mother. They're much more trusting. They're energetic. So this is making a difference. I think a huge concern one of the initial concerns was what was happening to the children. And that certainly remains a major concern but has been somewhat alleviated, and now just trying to broaden this to get these mother and children help as they move away from San Antonio to other families all over the United States.
Right, right. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're seeing some progress and some changes and some differences moving in the right direction. One thing I was wondering about is the effect that this has had on like the San Antonio Friends meeting community specifically, as a group of Quakers in a meeting. I mean, in the article, you talk in the we sense, and it is clear that this is everyone's sort of on board. And there's a quote in the article that I want to say here. Hold on, let me find it. Because of our group actions on this issue, we have become more alive and committed as a faith community than many of us have ever experienced before in our meetings. In many ways, it has brought us together, and together we are stronger. We are also becoming more visible and connected to the wider community through this work. So what's your insight behind that? I'd love to hear from you as individual friends.
Yeah. Well, I think the meeting discovered some resources, that we had resources to help these people. And we had a real desire. It was brought by different people. Tessa Pollock flew on a plane. She was going back to New York. She discovered these two children she realized they were not with their parents until they got to this airport in New York, and these children started wailing and crying. And the psychologist, Gary Whiting, that we have in our meeting, said that's not a normal crying of missing someone. That's a crying and a wailing of someone that's been severely traumatized. So Gary Whiting, the psychologist, he's devoted every Friday to going down to Carnes and to do psychological profiles on these mothers and children, which has helped immensely in courts to get them, out on bond, and in some cases to win their outright asylum. And maybe Lee can speak a little to that.
Yeah, it's amazing the resources just in the one Friends meeting. People who could who had an interest in whether it was to help raise money with a theater group, or to go do visitation, who can speak Spanish. Tessa, for instance, speaks Spanish, so she would go do visitation and meet with some of the women who just need somebody to talk to. And then Dr. Whiting's contribution was wonderful and phenomenal, and a real important experience for him personally. So I do think it brought the meeting together and closer, because everybody had some interest and some contribution. And then to reach out to the other faith groups and meet other people within the community who themselves had different talents or different interests, and would find a way in which they could help as part of their group or as part of the larger group, the IWC.
And some members even, volunteering, if they didn't have space in their house, even volunteering money to pay for hotel rooms and motel rooms for their tourists coming in. And then we had a Mayfair this year to raise money, and the entire Friends meeting, San Antonio became involved with the Mayfair to raise money for bonds and to have a Raíces booth, and we keep trying to educate our community too about what's happening, and which has been a central effort.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it. We were very honored to publish this in Friends Journal and share it with the wider community of readers, it's clear that this is, a coming together of many different skills and gifts and way opening, and I wholly appreciate each of your lives and what you're doing there in the community. We will include in the show notes here links to the various organizations that were mentioned, and links to Friends Meeting of San Antonio's website, Raíces website, and the Interfaith Coalition. Thank you so much again for taking the time to talk with me. So we're out of time here. But again, I really appreciate it, and we hope to hear more from you guys soon. Keep us updated.
You will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.